Good morning and welcome to the Jamestown Foundation. I'm Peter Mattis, its new president. And as we kick off the week of the NATO summit, I'm very pleased to be releasing a new report by Dr. Taras Kuzio on Crimea, where Russia's war began and where Ukraine will win. I think in this report, Dr. Kuzio reminds us what is at stake in this war and what we have learned from Russia's occupation of the Crimea and eastern Ukraine in these last 10 years. That this is not simply a war contest over small pieces of territory, but Putin has described his aims in this war as quite maximalist, saying that Ukraine is not a country. And it's hard not to take these words seriously when you see the targeting of Ukrainian children, their deportation from occupied areas, and as we saw this morning, the targeting of a children's hospital. So I would like to pass this very quickly over to Taras to speak to his report, because he's done some really remarkable work and detailed what has taken place and what we have learned and what really is at stake in this war that Russia began, well, we could say in February 2022, but really this began in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea. And today, in addition to Taras, who serves as a professor at the Kyiv Moya Academy and an associate fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, we're joined by Ambassador Daniel Fried, who is the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council and someone who has seen U.S. foreign policy from the vantage point at the White House, from Main State, and from Post. And it's hard to think of someone who, in these last 30-odd years, has played a more important role in the implementation of U.S. foreign policy than Ambassador Fried. And I think this is reflective of the way that we would like to do a lot of events here at Jamestown Foundation, where we are able to combine our unique area expertise that we have from people like Dr. Kuzio with the foreign policy expertise and the implications for the United States of someone like Ambassador Fried. And I think that this makes for a nice way to discuss our reports and to discuss products, and particularly at a time like this. And before I turn it over to Taras, I just would like to point out that he was the author of a report in 2010 for the Jamestown Foundation saying that Crimea was Europe's next flashpoint. And I was a young China Brief editor at the time from 2011 to 2013 at Jamestown, and I recall reading the report. And it was one of those reports that, as someone who did not look at Russia and who frankly did not have a basic understanding of Russia other than where it was, frankly, I was a little shocked at the way that he connected events, the way that he connected Putin's words, and why he had pinpointed Crimea. It was also an incredible learning experience from the standpoint of the analytic tools that I had learned as an American and in understanding China were not necessarily the ones that I should apply to Russia. And the lingering nature of his words as I was studying at Cambridge when the Russians went into the Crimea, I was a little bit shocked and realized that I needed to reframe what I knew and how I understood the world, because I clearly did not understand Vladimir Putin and his framing of Russian objectives. And I think that was a big wake-up call and probably one of the most dramatic think tank I told you so's that has been published. And I recall very clearly at the time, one of my classmates at Cambridge stood up and after a speaker had said, well, Crimea is filled with Russians, and so we shouldn't really care that much either way. And my classmate, who was ethnically Russian from Crimea, stood up and said, look, if I wanted to be a part of Russia, I'd have moved to Russia, but I'm Ukrainian, and this is where I live, and they invaded my home. I think it's a powerful reminder that people have made choices, countries have made commitments, and here we are. So over to you, Dr. Kuzio. If you could provide some opening remarks on your report. And I'd just like to remind everyone that you can insert your questions into the Q&A, and we'll start with a little round from Dr. Kuzio, Ambassador Fried, and then to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the nice and detailed introduction. I do recall when the report came out in 2010, there was a bit of skepticism that this was likely to happen, that there was going to be a flashpoint in Crimea. And so maybe because of that, and because it was the same year that Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president, became leader of Ukraine, it didn't get the publicity it deserved. But ironically, 3 to 4 years later, I was getting flooded by phone calls from journalists and academics saying, wow, you wrote about this 3 or 4 years ago and now it's happening. So it was one of those strange experiences. We are now 10 years on from the initial invasion and the annexation, the first territorial conquest that's taken place in Europe since 1945. And I'm framing this within a kind of a broader context, which I think we'll go on to and probably more, of the degree to which this was a wake-up call or not. We already had Georgia in 2008. That was totally ignored by the West. And in many ways in Europe, I would say President Mikhail Saakashvili was actually blamed more than Russia for the brief Russian-Georgian war. In 2014, it wasn't really a major wake-up call for the West. And this is what's bizarre, and I think what historians will have a field day writing about this. As I pinpoint in the paper, most Western leaders, kind of privately, sometimes publicly, would tell President Petro Poroshenko to forget about the Crimea. It's gone. It's lost forever. Don't even bother trying to get it back. At the time of the invasion, the US administration, then President Barack Obama, told the Ukrainians not to fight for Crimea. It was a very strange experience that this was taking place. And this kind of attitude towards the Crimea was there throughout the period running up to the full-scale invasion in 2022. And hence, Crimea was never included in the so-called peace agreements, the so-called Minsk Accords, that only applied to the Donbass, not to the Crimea, because Putin claimed that Crimea was over. It was gone. There's nothing to talk about. And that was a generally held view as well of the West. Remember, this was a time where there was very few sanctions against Russia. The sanctions were pretty mild. They only really kicked in after the shooting down of MH17 in July of 2014, which led to the loss of 298 innocent civilians, including 88 children. Germany continued to build Nord Stream 2. But crucially here, I think, Ukraine felt betrayed. It felt betrayed because of the Budapest Memorandum was ignored, not only by the US, but also by Britain. Now Lord Cameron, previously, before the elections, Foreign Minister of Britain, was then Prime Minister. He also ignored the Budapest Memorandum. Britain and the US and other Western countries were opposed to Ukraine being sent military aid. President Obama vetoed this on a number of occasions. And I quote a survey done by Foreign Affairs Journal, where most US-based academics who deal with Russia were also opposed to the sending of military aid to Ukraine. So this was a very kind of a bizarre period going up to, I say, the full-scale invasion. Ironically, and this is where I want to sort of try to be a bit more balanced, it's not just Donald Trump who's the bad guy here. There's fault, I think, on both sides. Donald Trump actually was the president who did not veto the sending of military aid to Ukraine, which Obama had done. And we know that Donald Trump imposed sanctions on the building of Nord Stream 2. What I think is true to say is that these very weak signals of Western responses to 2014, both the occupation and annexation of Crimea and the occupation of about 40 to 50% of the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, sent the signal which led to a major miscalculation on the part of Russia. I think there are two reasons why Russia thought it would get away with the full-scale invasion of 2022. One was that it believed again the West would send a very weak signal. It would just give it a slap on the wrist. There'd be no real major repercussions. Of course, Russia was wrong on that occasion, but it believed that because of how the West had been weak, both in Georgia, but particularly in 2014, Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And the second one was more domestic. The Kremlin was convinced that Ukrainians would be greeting the Russian army as they so-called liberated Ukraine. Both fallacies, both conceptions were wrong. They had grounding, particularly the view of how the West would react. They had grounding in the previous decade of how the West was I think perceived as quite weak vis-a-vis what had been taking place in Ukraine. Ironically, President Zelensky, who you could say was more of a moderate compared to Petro Poroshenko, a centrist as opposed to a center-right politician, somebody from eastern Ukraine, was actually more radical and more pushy on the question of Crimea. He demanded to President Putin that the Minsk Accords be expanded to include Crimea. Of course, Putin disagreed with that. And President Zelensky also created something called the Crimean Platform to lobby to have Crimea brought back into the discussion of reaching some kind of agreement, peace deal with Russia. And therefore, it's not surprising that President Zelensky has actually focused a lot of attention on Crimea since the full-scale invasion. Ukraine has been very successful in demilitarizing the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol, from Crimea, of allowing it to relaunch its trade exports in grain, going out from Odessa along the Romanian and Bulgarian coasts. The level of trade is now pretty much back to the pre-war levels. And so that I think has changed, and this has been done by a country with basically no navy, because Russia stole most of Ukraine's vessels in 2014 and 2022. But what really hasn't changed very much is West's hesitancy. Of course, it's not as hesitant as it was in 2014, but nevertheless, there's still quite a bit of hesitancy on the part of the West. And therefore, Ukraine, and I think generally Eastern Europeans, feel as though they're in this sort of middle ground, no man's land. The US and, of course, Germany hiding behind the back of the US is not openly, and has never openly said its goal is Russia's military defeat. In fact, the Biden administration has never said what its goal is in supporting Ukraine militarily. And this is therefore, I think, an honest, I think it's quite a good criticism on the part of the Republicans here, because what is the end goal of providing military support to Ukraine if it's not Ukraine's military victory as a consequence of Russian military defeat? But this has never been stated publicly. I think the other factor that we'll probably talk more about during the discussion about policies, government policies, is issues such as the drip supply of weaponry to Ukraine. The fact that Ukraine's been forced to fight with one arm up its back. The question of NATO membership. Again, let's not focus completely always on Donald Trump. Both Republican and Democratic presidents since 2009, Obama, Trump, and Biden, have all opposed Ukraine's membership of NATO. And that includes, probably likely this week, Ukraine will again be fobbed off and not be offered a NATO membership. Criticism from the US administration about Ukraine attacks on Russian energy facilities. I think the key thing here is, what is the goal? What is the goal? Ukraine believes, and I think rightly so, and this paper argues this, is that this entire Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and therefore conflict with the West, began in Crimea in the spring of 2014, and that's where it will end. Once the Crimea is demilitarized, once Crimea is no longer able to be a major military base for Russia, then that will impede Russia's ability to continue its occupation of Ukraine and continue its fight. And my final point, a major part of the paper talks about what took place in the Crimea and parts of the Donbass that were occupied during the period between 2014 and 2022, which is the Ukrainian nation and attacks and repression of Crimean Tatars. So I would argue in both cases, genocide, the deliberate destruction of Crimean Tatar identity and Ukrainian identity, Russification, Sovietization, imprisonment, and destruction of all things Crimean Tatar Ukrainian, both schools, publications, monuments, cultural artifacts, and such like. We've already seen this having been taken place in the Crimea and in the Donbass. And we see those same policies being applied to occupied southeastern Ukraine, southern Zaporizhia Oblast, and eastern Kherson Oblast. If Ukraine was to be militarily defeated, then these kinds of policies, genocidal policies, would be applied to the rest of Ukraine. This, as we've already heard, the Kremlin leaders and Kremlin media journalists don't even hide what they plan to do. There's simply no debate. Their understanding of what they call denazification, a ridiculous term for a country where the far right is very unpopular and where there's a Jewish president, but their term of denazification is the same as the genocide of Ukrainian identity. The aim is to transform Ukraine into a kind of a little Russian variant of Lukashenko's Belarus, a pliant satellite Russian colony, in effect. That is the goal. And hence, this is an existential war for Ukraine that we can see the origins of which began in Crimea in 2014, then spread to the Donbass, and in 2022, because the Kremlin hadn't been able to achieve its goals in kind of pressurizing Ukraine to accept its terms in the Minsk Accords, Russia was forced to invade, and its goal has never changed, and that goal is the destruction of the Ukrainian state and destruction of Ukrainian identity and transformation of Ukraine into a little Russian variant of Belarus. On that note, I'll end. There's quite a lot of policy questions that I'm sure will come up, but I'll leave these to Ambassador Fried and maybe more for the discussion to talk about. Thank you very much.
Before we go over to Ambassador Fried, let me ask just one quick question as I think of to follow on and build off of what you had put together. Russian proxies have been pumping that liberation narrative into the countries of the old Warsaw Pact or in other former Soviet satellites. And I was wondering how we should look at that kind of articulation, that disinformation push, or rather an information push, to shape people's understanding. Because again, when I read your paper back in 2010, I dismissed this kind of thing as a real consideration or a concern. And yet here we see not just a liberation narrative for Ukraine, but being passed out and pushed into other countries. Do you think there are risks beyond Ukraine, or is this something where Putin's ambitions, his sort of imperialist ambitions, actually have real limits, or should we be concerned about this a more maximalist type of position from the Kremlin?
The goals of the Kremlin are clear. They want to destroy what they call the US-led unipolar world, whatever that is. That's how they describe it. In this, they have allies with China, Iran, North Korea, and probably some other countries. They want to return to what they call the multipolar world of the Cold War, where not just the US, but say the USSR, now Russia, would be also a major actor. They draw on what was Soviet anti-colonial rhetoric and discourse to argue and to champion that the USSR, now Russia, are the true defenders of countries who previously were suffered from Western colonialism and are still suffering to some degree. Of course, this is completely ludicrous because Putin talks as though Russia was never an empire, that Russia was never an imperial country, that Russia never destroyed and subjugated and committed genocide against national minorities. This is all simply not true. I think this kind of discourse that the Kremlin promotes has some popularity in Africa, but I don't think beyond Africa it really does. In Latin America, you have a mixed bag of pro-Ukrainian, pro-kind of Russian countries. In Asia, also similarly as well, because of the threat of China. In reality, Russia and in particular China, these are imperialist, chauvinistic powers that are intent on destroying national minorities within their territory. By national minorities, these are small peoples, Ukrainians as well. The Chinese are committing genocide against the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. They are deliberately sending their children to boarding schools so that they learn only Han Chinese and they forget their Tibetan Uyghur culture. We know about 1 million Uyghurs who were imprisoned in camps. So the Chinese are no different in that sense from previous Western imperialist countries, but they obviously try to pretend otherwise. I think that the Chinese game is, I think, more seen as what it is in Asia. We see that the change in, for example, the Philippines and Indonesia as well. With Russia, I think the goal is not just the occupation of Ukraine, the destruction of Ukrainian identity, the bringing back of Ukraine into the Russian world. It's the destruction of the Western unipolar liberal world order, however you want to describe it. And that inevitably means continuing the war, if Ukraine is defeated, continuing the war by, say, attacking one of the Baltic states or another country, to try to undermine Article 5 in NATO by possibly suggesting that other countries would not come to the defense of, say, Estonia or Latvia, if there was some kind of hybrid warfare attacks against those countries. So there's simply no question that Russia or the Kremlin has bigger objectives in mind. It's not just Ukraine. But with Ukraine incorporated into the Russian world, you have 45 million people who would be dragooned into the new Russian army. You have massive resources, raw materials. You have a major military industrial complex that would all be working on behalf of Russia if Ukraine was subdued. And hence I think the dangers here are far greater than many believe, but I believe that views in Europe have now come round to the belief that if Ukraine is defeated, we are next. I mean, I think it is different to about a year or 2 years ago.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kuzio. And now, Ambassador Fried, over to you to help explain why this matters, what decisions are faced by Western policymakers, particularly those of us in the United States, and look forward to hearing you help put what Tarash has said into the context for the U.S. government and ourselves.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine matters for the same reasons that Hitler's invasion of Poland mattered or should have mattered to the United States. The U.S. fought 2 world wars and Cold War to prevent aggressive European tyrants from overrunning Europe. Pretty flat statement. We believe that it was in our national interest to prevent Europe from falling under the control of an aggressive tyrant. And that same principle applies in the war now. Now, the trouble I have in commenting about Taras Kuzio's paper is that, and his presentation, is that I agree with it. So what am I can't argue with him. I have a couple of supplemental points. He is spot on right that the Obama administration did not internalize the lessons of the Russo-Georgian War. If you take a look at Condi Rice's speech at the German Marshall Fund in September 2008, September or October, I'm not sure of the month, it's a speech which described the destroyed hopes of the US for working with Russia. But it was not, those lessons were not taken on board by the incoming Obama administration, which tried the reset. But even the Bush administration did not take Putin's warnings seriously enough. It downplayed Putin's aggressive speech at the Munich Security Conference in February 2007, and it did not understand that Putin was serious at the Bucharest 2008 NATO summit when he made a claim to Crimea. I was there. I was sitting in the audience next to the then Polish National Security Advisor when Putin said that in 1954, when Crimea was transferred from the RSFSR, the Russian Socialist Republic, to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, not all proper legal procedures were followed. And we both involuntarily stood up and said to each other, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" I tried unsuccessfully to convince my superiors at the State Department and NSC that this was a problem. One of them years later said, "Yeah, we should have listened to you more." And the Russo-Georgian War began in August. That is a few months later. So Taras Kuzio is right. The US did not take seriously enough the Kremlin's aggressive aims to reestablish the Russian Empire, including by means of war. And after 2014, it was slow to recognize the nature of the challenge. Now, I do want to take a second-order issue with Taras Kuzio. In fact, the Obama administration was wrong not to send weapons to Ukraine. That was a bad call. Okay, so flat out bad call. And many of us knew it at the time. The sanctions, however, and the transatlantic reaction to the invasion of Crimea and it followed quickly by the same tactics and invasion of the Donbass was stronger actually than many people remember. And I cite the Putin withdrawal temporarily from his claims of Novorossiya. Novorossiya was a Russian war aim that Putin was floating in the early weeks after the Crimea and Donbass invasion, but he dropped it. He dropped it after the US and European sanctions, which were, Taras Kuzio's right, they were moderate compared to the current sanctions, but they were strong enough that Putin actually temporarily dropped his claims to Novorossiya and agreed to the Minsk Accords, which for all their many flaws did recognize that the Donbass is Ukrainian sovereign territory, and they marked a process, marked out a process for the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty to its eastern international border. Now, there are some who will immediately object that Russia had no intention of implementing the Minsk Accords and did not do so, and that would be right. That's correct. But the Minsk Accords themselves represented a step back by Putin. Our problem was that we did not keep up the pressure in the Obama administration when it became clear that the Russians were not going to honor the Minsk Accords. Okay, so that's, I don't know whether that's a difference of view, but that is it's more like a footnote to what Taras Kuzio was saying, because fundamentally he is right. the West, in the end, did not respond with sufficient strength to Putin's aggression against Ukraine. And we did set the stage for that aggression to continue. I will, since Taras Kuzio pointed out that the Trump administration wasn't all bad, I will submit for the record as supporting evidence the so-called Pompeo Doctrine, which was modeled after the Pompeo Declaration, modeled on the Wells Declaration of 1940, by which the United States refused to recognize the Soviet incorporation of the Baltic states, a policy which the U.S. maintained all the way till 1991. And this was something that the, let us say, more serious strategic thinkers in the first Trump administration pushed. I'm thinking of Ambassador Kurt Volker. And it's actually important to remember this in case there is a second Trump administration. I say, I have my own rather strong views about whether this is a good idea, but happily, this is not the place for me to express them. I do think that the Pompeo Declaration is important. More broadly, Taras Kuzio is, I'm sorry to say, spot on right about Putin's intentions. I mean, you don't have to read his article, just read what Putin says. He has made clear that he is obsessed with restoring the Russian Empire in general, and in particular obsessed with the 17th century, which was the century in which Russia, or Muscovy, took the initiative and set the conditions for overcoming the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And the way they did that is by winning the fight over Ukraine. I won't go into the details, but Putin is obsessed with the 17th century, which was Russia's success. And he seems to be alarmed that that success is now in question, as it would be if Ukraine joined Europe as a member of the wider European family. Putin is right in a sense. That eventuality, which has begun with the accession talks between Ukraine and the EU, would mark a reversal of the verdict of history in the 17th century and would mark another chance for Ukraine to become a European country, realizing a European future. Putin is willing to maintain war to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one last point. Much depends on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how it's going to end. I really don't know. I do not think Russian success is inevitable, nor is Ukrainian success. We don't know. We do know that the collective West has the ability to move the needle. I'm not saying that we hold in our hands the key to inevitable Ukrainian success. I don't think we do. But I think we can affect the outcome, and therefore we have an obligation to do so.
Mm-hmm.
It is also true, well, there is a school of foreign policy very loud lately that call themselves realists, by which they seem to mean that we must be realistic, Ukraine will never succeed, and we must push them to giving up their territory. That describes to me not realism, but a kind of defeatism. Realism is important, but realism should not be elevated to the status of doctrine, because then it risks becoming mere power worship. Realists dismissed the Wells Doctrine. They dismissed the notion that the Iron Curtain would ever fall, that Eastern Europe, Poland, the original cause of the Cold War, would ever be free, or that the Baltic states would ever be independent. In the end, that sort of doctrinal realist view turned out to be not very realistic at all. Realism, however, does also require us to think that Ukraine might not win. Not all negotiations are a betrayal. I'm not against all negotiations. I'm against dumb ones. And a dumb negotiation is to start the process by accepting Putin's essential terms. which is what a lot of people do. That is not the only way to discuss negotiations or to approach them. That is also not the topic of this discussion. But I'll end here, the chief value of Taras Kuzio's study is that he lays out in detail Russia's aims and tactics. If we are going to contemplate various futures for Ukraine, which might involve a future less than a complete Ukrainian victory, we must do so on the basis of, shall I say, a realistic appraisal of Russia's war aims. We must be realistic that Putin wants his empire. We must not engage in fatuous optimism that this is all a misunderstanding or a problem of trust, or there's a problem of NATO enlargement and encroaching on Russia's natural space. No, stop it. Russia's natural space is another way for saying they get to beat up people and extinguish nations, because that's what a Russian sphere of influence means in practice. So I am not saying that under all circumstances, there is no alternative but liberating every inch of Ukrainian territory. I am saying that we have to be very clear about what Russia intends in this war. Okay, final thought. In the war, one of Ukrainians' noted strategic successes has been to damage severely the Russian military presence in Crimea. That is a major success. It's not just the Russian Black Sea Fleet, though it is also that. But the Ukrainians have managed to reduce that Russian military presence. We should not assume that in all settlements, Crimea must remain part of Russia, or that we are obligated to recognize an annexation, or even give up the possibilities of Crimea returning to Russia. Never is a very long time. I went from the Baltic states will never be independent to visiting them when they became independent. Anyway, those are my thoughts, and it's a pleasure. It was a pleasure to read the piece, even though it is an ugly piece because it describes Russian policy, which is ugly. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fried. If I could put one question to you, I know it's a big one, but if you had a couple of thoughts on how it might fit together, because I think as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about China and Asia, and now being forced to think broadly about the world in a way that I haven't been before, I'm curious why you think that Western policymakers, and particularly the US policymakers with whom you've had the most contact, have had trouble understanding Putin's aims and his decision making, given that you described him underplaying and trying to reset and trying to avoid some of the risks that come with this, or to downplay them. And I'd be curious why, given that there is a fairly robust core of Russia expertise inside the State Department, inside the intelligence community, Defense Department, that people have had long experience, why has there been this kind of underestimation of Putin's aims and a lack of appropriate response?
Oh, I disagree with part of the premise of the question, happily. I think there is a good appreciation of Putin's aims. If you talk to them, they understand what Putin is up to. They are far more committed to Ukraine's success in this war than the Obama administration or the Trump administration. You can, if you want, criticize the either deliberate speed or foot dragging, depends on how harsh you want to be, about the provision to Ukraine of various weapon systems. I mean, that can be fairly criticized. But in my discussions with the administration, I have not heard echoed the arguments of what I call the fatuous or doctrinal realist school, which has it that basically Ukraine belongs to Russia because we believe in spheres of influence. I've not heard that at all.
Master Fried, I wasn't actually speaking to criticize the administration. I was looking back into the past, going from sort of the invasion of Georgia in 2008
Okay.
2014,
Now I got
that
you. Right.
we've in a sense, as Tarash pointed out, that we have slow rolled these events or slow rolled our response, and we ended up in a place where that we seemed
I
cheap,
got you.
be willing to acquiesce. So
yeah, I got you. Well, I was in the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, and there was a reasonable basis to believe that we could work with Putin. Now, that didn't turn out to be the case, okay? We couldn't. But when you look back, we didn't know him. There was a reasonable basis. I think we were all too slow to recognize the problem. People recognized that Putin was not who we hoped he would be fairly early on, but people drew conclusions at different speeds. And I've described some of the miscues in 2008. I think the Obama people came in and wanted to do the reset. And they tended to brush aside the lessons of the Russo-Georgian War, thinking that somehow, some of them, not all of them, some of them thought that somehow this was a Russian reaction to some miscalculation by the Bush administration, or that we had egged Saakashvili on to be aggressive and move in, some stuff like this, which was simply not true. But I will give credit to the Obama administration. After the 2014 invasion, they responded by supporting Ukraine. They were wrong about the weapons, not delivering weapons to Ukraine. I think they were flat wrong about that, and I'm not going to change my mind easily. But Obama did reverse 20 years of American military drawdown in Europe and decided to push NATO to send combat forces to the Baltic states and Poland, and added that with a U.S. armored brigade going to Poland. Now, that's a big deal. That's to his credit. But you notice I haven't taken issue with your central contention, right? Which is that we were slow to recognize the problem. You know, it reminds me of a Herman Melville novelette, Benito Cereno, where the well-meaning American sea captain looks at another ship through the prism of his own experience and his own prejudices, and has absolutely no idea what is actually happening aboard that other ship. None at all. It's the Benito Cereno problem. We don't always recognize that one of our interlocutors has a completely different set of values and objectives. And it took a while for that lesson to sink in, especially since we had hopes that a different Russia would emerge from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Anyway, that's a long answer to a perfectly reasonable question.
this question from our watchers and listeners for Tarash. In the case of a Ukrainian victory and being able to reclaim Crimea, and I think the same could be extended to other parts of Ukraine that are under Russian occupation, what is Ukrainian policies likely to be toward the sort of the settlers and colonists that the Russians have moved in, and of the collaborators with Moscow that are Ukrainian?
Well, it's a big question. I think these are policies which are in the process of being developed. I mean, I doubt that there are fixed policies already. On collaborators, that is already taking place if they're captured. And there were even strange cases of Russian soldiers who had been in the Ukrainian army in 2014, but defected, who were captured by Ukraine, and so they didn't become prisoners of war. They were criminally charged as collaborators. So on collaborators, there are laws in place where people are sent to jail for all sorts of things, both being agents and working for Russian occupation authorities, and that's already happening, as it were. In some cases, they are physically liquidated, as we've seen with car bombings and otherwise, people who are implementing Russian policy on behalf of the occupation authorities. Again, this is nothing unusual. This kind of thing happened, of course, in World War II as well, undertaken by partisan groups. On the question of settlers, I suspect a large number of them would simply flee. They wouldn't wait to find out what would happen to them. And for others, I think it's going to be a very difficult question. I think, Crimea is one thing, but the Russians are deliberately bringing in a lot of settlers into Mariupol, which was flattened in the spring of 2022. And a huge number of people were killed or expelled or sent to Russia. They are deliberately trying to re-engineer the port city as a Russian city. So that returning to Ukraine will be a major headache for Ukraine in terms of what to do with those people. I suspect, though, I don't know to what percentage, but a large percentage will simply be too scared to stay and to wait to find out what would happen, and they would simply leave otherwise. But it's always going to be, these kinds of questions are always going to be there. I mean, you could ask the same question, for example, in the Baltic states. Many Russians moved into Estonia and Latvia after 1945. Both of those countries implemented citizenship policies where Russian settlers were given a long period of time to adapt to the requirements to become a citizen. So there wasn't like in Ukraine, everybody who was in the country on the 1st of January 1992 received automatically Ukrainian citizenship. That didn't happen in Estonia and Latvia because they had to deal with that settler question as well. Some left for Russia, some stayed. But for them to stay, they had to learn the local language. They had to apply for naturalization to become citizens, and that was a long process in those two countries. So there are precedents, but yes, we will certainly be. The longer this continues, the longer this will be more difficult, and hence why Russia is deliberately implementing these policies of de-Ukrainization, Russification, Sovietization in occupied southeastern Ukraine rapidly. It's a rapid process that they're doing to try to make it irreversible, so that it can't be changed by Ukraine when these territories are liberated. Is it possible for me to say a few comments about the previous discussion, or do you want to move on to questions?
We've got a number of questions that are coming in.
Okay. Sure.
If
we've got time at the end. We've got time at the end, yeah.
So one question that we have is why doesn't Ukraine simply take out the Kerch Strait Bridge in sort of one of the most direct ways to provide supplies to Crimea? I think that's ideal for you.
Well, I'm not a complete military expert, but as far as I understand, to take out that kind of facility, you need a specific type of missile, and the British and Storm Shadow and the French Scalp missiles would not be able to do that. The best missile, as far as I understand, which could do that, would be the German Taurus, which Chancellor Scholz has continued to refuse to send to Ukraine. I'm not sure about the ATACMS, whether they are able to do something there. There's certainly the US is allowing Ukraine to use as ATACMS to attack targets in Crimea, but it's more circumspect about Ukraine using ATACMS to attack targets inside Russia itself. So I think it's more a question of the material of the specific type of missile that Ukraine has, whether it's possible to do it. I'm sure that if Ukraine was given the type of missile that could do that objective, it would do it. It's not so much because it's, I think, useful for Russian the military, which it is to some degree, but it's symbolic. It was built in 2018 by Putin as a kind of a showcase bridge that united Crimea with Russia. So symbolically, it would be very important for it to be destroyed. So I'm suspecting that because Ukrainians haven't done it, they don't have the right missiles yet to do it.
So to get to another forward-looking question, what do you think the loss of Crimea will produce inside Russia domestically? What are the consequences that Putin might feel for this? And related, I think this goes to both of you, is that there seems to be a balancing between the issue of Ukrainian victory on the battlefield and a defeat for Russia that forces a kind of domestic disintegration. And is this something that a breakdown of political order in Russia, something that is a reasonable consequence of the defeat in Ukraine? And if so, or if not, is this something that that you think that U.S. policymakers should reasonably fear as they're making decisions about what kind of support is given to Ukraine?
Do you want me to go first, or Ambassador?
I think that's a good question for you to start with, Dr. Kuzio.
Okay. I think that it's a bit of a deja vu for me, because I remember 1990, 91, and we're in the same kind of era. Then President Bush Sr. was also afraid of the USSR disintegrating. The fear was there would be a nuclear Yugoslavia, and hence President Bush made this horrible speech in Kiev in early August of 1991, which became nicknamed the Chicken Kiev speech, where he said Ukrainians don't go for independence. There was a kind of a dramatic turnaround in 1990. Up until then, the US policy was to support the disintegration of the USSR. After that, there was a kind of a fear of what this would lead to. I think we have this similar kind of fear in the Biden administration today, and I think it's misplaced for a number of reasons. Firstly, historically, after every single military defeat that Russia has had, going back to the 19th century, always reformers, not crazy nationalists, come to power. That's true after the Crimean War, after the Japanese-Russian War, and after in 1917 as well, before the Bolsheviks took over. So you could argue the same here, that a Russian military defeat would lead to the coming to power of more liberal type of Russians. At the same time, I think it's important for us to look to how this kind of problem with Russia will not reappear down the road. And what we missed in the 1990s was support for Russia moving towards a post-imperial civic identity. And that was missed by us in the West. We didn't focus on that sufficiently. I think we just focused on economic reform, transition to a market economy, and it wasn't focused enough by Boris Yeltsin, then the Russian president. What do I mean by this? Most Russians have never had since 1991 a post-imperial civic identity which is comfortable with the borders of the Russian Federation. They've always seen Russia, in inverted commas, as something bigger, whether it's the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, Eurasia, former USSR, Tsarist Empire, whatever. And of course, Putin's one of those. The only way we're going to have peace with Russia is a move towards a post-imperial Russian civic identity. And that is there with certain politicians like Alexei Navalny, who's a liberal nationalist, but he's a post-Soviet, post-imperial liberal nationalist. He accepts Russia's borders. And I think that is what we need to focus on as one of the potential advantages that would accrue, this de-imperialization of Russian identity as a consequence of Russia's military defeat. This would be a big plus both for Russians and for us and for Russia's neighbors. I think historians will be writing that it was wrong to say this was the end of history in the early 1990s. In fact, Russia then, because of a multitude of factors, exchanged communism for nationalism, not communism for democracy, because that democratic window in Russia really began to decline after Russian tanks destroyed or attacked the Russian parliament in 1993. So a defeat of Russia in this war is a plus for the Russian people, and it's a plus for Russia's neighbors and for Russia's ability to be comfortable with its surroundings.
Master Fried?
I agree with the 2 points. One, Russia's defeat in this war of imperial aggression will be critical to getting the Russians to reconsider their imperial mindset. And I'm with Andreas Kubilius on this one. He believes there is a democratic potential in Russia, and given his background, he has some credibility making that statement, but that road must lead through a Russian defeat. I wasn't working on U.S.-Russia policy in the 90s, but I was sort of policy adjacent. And we did have exaggerated hopes for Russia. We accepted the view that the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of communism in Russia liberated the Russians. We downplayed the Russian imperial mindset, and we downplayed the political impact inside Russia of the traumatic loss of empire. We underemphasized that. And that was simply an analytical mistake. But I'm not sorry we reached out to Russia at the time. And we did reach out to Russia on the conditions that it become an ordinary country, not an imperial country. Strobe Talbot has taken a lot of criticism over the years, but he was consistent in this view that his outreach to Russia was predicated on Russia becoming a country. And Strobe Talbot was very early recognizing that Putin was a problem. He did so while he was still Deputy Secretary of State in 2000. He was one of the first people to recognize that Putin was not the leader, the kind of modernizing strongman many people hoped he might be. So I'll give Strobe that credit. His policy toward Russia didn't work out. I'm not sorry we tried, because had we not tried, there would be all the people who say that that Putin's aggression is our fault because we enlarged NATO, who now have no serious case, would have a case if we had not tried. We did try. If Russia is defeated in Ukraine, there may, depending on the circumstances of that defeat, there may come another opportunity. Although, frankly, I find it more likely that Putin's immediate successors, in the case of a Russian defeat or stalemate, might follow Stalin's successors, who, not good guys, right? Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev before the secret speech. They all pulled back from Soviet confrontation with the West and supported the Austrian State Treaty and supported the Korean armistice, not because they were good guys or liberals, but because they knew that Russia was that the Soviet Union was overextended. I find that more likely. And we should not rule out the possibility of dealing with these people, but we should not start chasing or continue chasing after Vladimir Putin. I've seen this. I've seen the way this works. Administrations have tried it, and this is both parties have been guilty. Don't chase after them. Don't throw bouquets at their feet consisting of more and more offers about Ukraine or anything else. When the Russians want to negotiate, they know how to negotiate. They can be skilled diplomats. They can find solutions. And when they don't want to negotiate, they're very skilled at not finding solutions. And right now, Vladimir Putin doesn't want a solution. He's insisting on maximal aims, beyond aims which go even beyond Russia's abilities to succeed on the battlefield. These are not serious. The Russians are capable of serious negotiations, but not yet. And in Putin's place, you can understand why he chooses not to be serious. He is maybe hoping for a Trump world victory and hoping to get a better deal from a new administration. He might have been hoping for a right-wing, a hard right victory in France. Didn't happen, but you can understand that he might be counting on this. So between now and our elections, the wise course is to help Ukraine do better on the battlefield and increase the pressure on the Russian economy through sanctions. Sorry to go on, but these are serious issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to put a question there, because we did say that we would go until 11:15, and as much as I would like to keep it to an hour, I think we've had a rich discussion, and I want to keep it going a little bit. So I'll put in a question that I have for both of you, especially since Ambassador Fried, you were the ambassador responsible for coordinating sanctions policy and trying to pull all of this together. One of the biggest changes since the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, Tarash, was the level of Chinese support for Russian aims. And I would be curious how you would describe, in as simply as possible, what you see China's role in this war as being. And to you, Ambassador Fried, I think the question is, how would you conceive of an effective deterrent using some of the tools of sanctions or others, if appropriate, for either getting the PRC to reduce its support to Russia or to deter further support for the Russians on the battlefield?
Well, I think I would probably divide my answer into three parts. Firstly, China comes across as a complete hypocrite, double standards. It's one of the strongest supporters of the territorial integrity of states in the world. You know how tough it is on issues of East Turkestan, Tibet, and of course Taiwan. And now it's sort of playing with the question of whether Ukraine should give up territory for a peace agreement. So that is a complete case of hypocrisy and double standards on the part of China. At the same time, I think that China is in a quandary in that it cannot. My own kind of gut feeling is that it thinks that Russia was foolishly mistaken to launch the war, but now that Russia's at war, it would be a very bad idea to allow Russia to be defeated. So I think the difference, and that's a reflection of the difference between, I would say, Russian imperial nationalism and Chinese imperial nationalism. The Chinese are far more patient. Putin is a very angry man. He's very impatient. He wants his legacy. He wants to go into Russian history as somebody who follows in the footsteps of Peter the Great, Catherine, Ivan the Terrible, and Stalin. Literally, there are book series and billboard posters at schools in Russia which has him in that kind of context. I think the Chinese here are far more patient. They think the future maybe is there, so they can wait it out, as it were. So they think Russia was mistaken, but they can't allow Russia to be defeated, and hence they, I think, are confidentially, secretly providing Russia with some military support, but not complete. They're not providing Russia with complete military support, because maybe they could. It's sort of it's sort of also a drip approach. Finally, China's fully on board with the ultimate goal of the Kremlin, which is the defeat of the Western liberal US so-called led unipolar world and a return to some kind of multipolarism. China's fully on board with that goal. And therefore, if Ukraine has to be sacrificed on the way to that goal, then China's all in favor of it. So I think it's a mixture of all of those different areas. Probably with one final point, China's less hostile to the international economic order, which it has benefited from, than, say, Russia, particularly Russia now, which is reeling, which is totally isolated from the international economic world, as it were. So I would say it's a sort of mixed picture, but that's somebody like myself, not a Chinese expert. I think on just finally Taiwanese question, there's simply no question that China international affairs is often just signals. Often is very much a question of signals, and if the West were to allow Ukraine to be defeated and Russia to be victorious, that would certainly send a signal to China that it could have potentially far less pushback from the West if it were to invade Taiwan. So there's obviously a connection there. I hope the Taiwanese are learning a lot about military tactics from what the Ukrainians are doing, particularly on sea drones. So I think it's a mixture of different factors.
On the question of sanctions, sanctions can do a lot if you're not greedy or impatient. They're not going to put enough pressure on the Russian economy in time to save Ukraine. They won't be the fix. But they can damage the Russian economy and are already doing so. And that damage can be construed if you read the numbers. Vladimir Milov's stuff is pretty good on this subject. There are other analysts who are pretty good. We could do a lot more. The Biden administration sanctions package in February, second anniversary of the war, was weak. The sanctions package in June was actually very good. That was a solid package. The only thing missing there were harder measures to enforce the oil price cap. And I think that the Biden people are concerned, maybe over-concerned about a spike in crude oil prices. I understand the concern. I'm just not sure that oil price cap enforcement would lead to a spike in crude oil prices, but that's their concern. There is more we could do. It will involve, I'm afraid, difficult secondary sanctions against the Chinese if they are blatant about circumventing the sanctions. It will also require more pressure on third countries that act as transit points for goods going through them to Russia, or not even through them to Russia, just to Russia, but with some kind of paperwork trail that makes it look like they're going to Kyrgyzstan. But before we think of Central Asian countries or Georgia or Armenia or other countries as the problem, let's remember that Western manufacturers do not have the same culture of sanctions compliance as Western banks. Western banks take sanctions compliance seriously. They hire a lot of compliance people. They do due diligence. Manufacturers' record is much more mixed. They are more prone, if I can generalize, to accept an assurance about ultimate end users rather than knowing where that stuff is going that they export downstream. So we have to look at the manufacturers. And if I were in my old job, I would be trying to find blatant examples of negligence by a company, of basically pretending to know its customer when it didn't, and accepting winks and nods. And I would go after that company, first a warning and then hitting them hard. And this will also require beefing up the Commerce Department's, because Commerce Department, not Treasury, does technology sanctions. It will require beefing up their resources to allow them to fulfill this role. And we have to take this seriously, as much as we did in the Cold War. Now, final point about sanctions. If you read the literature of the 1980s, It was almost unanimous that sanctions against the Soviet Union were a failure, somewhere between a failure and a joke. And yet, if you look back on the 1980s, they ended up pretty well for us and not for the Soviet economy. It is true that what hit the Soviet economy was a sagging price of oil, but what the sanctions and various other economic measures meant was that it was harder for the Soviet Union to compensate for its lack of reform and its dependence on oil exports by getting cheap Western credits and Western technology. The sanctions didn't work all that well, but they worked well enough. And you see where I'm headed with this. We need to keep up the sanctions on Russia and not simply buy into the Russian propaganda of success. You can see that the militarization of the Russian economy is putting pressure on the civilian sector. And we saw this starting in the late 1970s with the Soviet economy. So squeeze hard would be my advice. Now, we'll see whether that works out. We'll see if there is another Trump administration, they're apt to push on negotiations and offer sanctions relief as an incentive. Some of their ideas are the sort of thing that Reaganites or people like John Bolton used to make a meal of when proposed in the past. We'll see whether whether such hard-eyed skepticism is used during a second Trump administration if we get there.
Before I go to one last question to both of you, I would just highlight that many of the things that Dr. Kuzio and Ambassador Fried have raised, whether it's Putin's approach to negotiations, the pressure on the Russian arms industry, have been written about quite regularly over the last 2 years in Eurasia Daily Monitor. So if you're not already a subscriber, I would recommend that you sign up. We've got a number of great contributors like Ambassador Boris Bondarev, who had actually served in the Kremlin and has seen the way decision-making takes place. We have people like Pavel Luzin, who have written quite well and are quite adept at reading between the lines of Russian statistics. And many of our other contributors, like Dr. Kuzio, have offered extraordinary insights, I think, into the conduct of the war on the part of Russia and the kinds of costs that Russia is incurring domestically. So,
all good advice, but the Atlantic Council also has a lively sanctions page vis-a-vis about the Russians. If I can engage in some think tank competition in the service of a worthy cause, which we share.
Children, come on.
But I think the last question, if you could take just 30 seconds apiece, I recognize that that's a difficult ask, but how do you see the war ending given where we stand today?
As I said earlier, Taras first then.
No, please. This is such a, you could have a whole panel on this. I mean, the scenarios. Let me just say, I'm not only myself, but even General Zaluzhny said that he thought 150,000 Russian dead or casualties would be sufficient. It would be the tipping point. And he was proven wrong. We're now getting up. There was economists citing leaked Pentagon documents this week saying that the casualty rate could be even higher than we realized, anything up to something like 720,000. That's killed and wounded. Although we know most Russian wounded die. This is just mind-boggling. One has to think, how long can this continue? When will Russians say enough? When will the 1917 moment come? So that's one aspect, one potential scenario. But I think that this could be provoked into happening, the 1917 moment, if Ukraine is given a lot more of the Western technology, Western military technology that it's been asking for, and continues with a huge casualty rate. Just to give you an idea, we're talking about something in the region of 1,200 Russian casualties a day. It's simply mind-boggling, what is taking place. When are Russians going to say enough? I think that will be a crucial factor in when this war ends. Coupled with, of course, the impact of sanctions, the impact of how the economy is being mismanaged with so much emphasis on military production, and such like. It's difficult to say. I agree what we've heard so far, that military experts seem to concur that Russia does not have the means to launch a full-scale offensives against Ukraine. It hasn't got the means to take large bouts of territory and large cities like Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Kiev, let alone Odessa. And that because that would require Russia or the Kremlin to launch another round of mobilization, which is unpopular, which could push Russia to that tipping point. And therefore, Putin has openly talked about just creeping advances, hoping that in the long term, Russia would gain from this attritional warfare because they have more people and more people willing to die than Ukraine has. So we have to counter that by, I think, trying to end the war as quickly as possible by giving Ukraine the means to end the war. A long war is bad for Ukraine, it's good for Russia. And I think that's something we should be thinking about. How we can get the war ended as quickly as possible with Ukraine victorious.
Some parting words from you, Ambassador Fried?
I don't know how the war will end. I really don't. But we do have the ability, as I said earlier, to move the needle, to affect the outcome. Right. And therefore, it is in our interests to do so. And we have to make, I don't think Putin will seriously look at an end to the war until he sees how the US elections come out. And then if Trump wins, till he sees how Trump comes out. But we should do everything we can now to move the needle in Ukraine's favor. Anyway, I've got to run, but thank you. This was a good discussion. And I thank Taras Kuzio for that paper. First class.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. And thank you very much, Ambassador Fried and Dr. Kuzio, for your participation and contributions. I hope you all have a wonderful day. And please read his report. You'll find Kuzio's report up on our website.